Is it ever right to execute a child?
Well, the United States and its predecessor, the 13 colonies, have a long and illustrious history of punishing children with death. Since 1642, it's estimated that 364 juveniles have been executed by the government. The first confirmed case was that of 16-year-old Thomas Granger, who was killed for buggery, which is British for sexing animals.
Keep your eyes peeled, boys! Somebody's gonna make love to this chicken any minute!
But his execution has nothing on the depravity of George Stinney Jr.'s death. George was the youngest person with a confirmed birth date to be executed by the United States in the 20th century. The year was 1944, and segregation was alive and well in South Carolina, especially in the small community of Alcolu, population 1,700. One side of the railway tracks designated the white side of town, and the other was the black side. In a ditch on the black side of town, next to a field littered with the husks from harvested corn, the mangled bodies of two white girls were found, 11-year-old Betty Jane Binneker and 7-year-old Mary Emma Thames. They were severely beaten and had fractured skulls. Suspicion fell on a 14-year-old black boy named George Stinney Jr. after it was discovered he had seen the girls the previous day. George's sister, Amy, was with him by their family's chicken coop when two black cars rolled up and took him away. That was the final time she ever saw him alive. George was quickly put on trial before a jury of 12 white men. The state did not have much evidence against him, besides an alleged confession to the murder where George did not have a lawyer present. And we all know that police would never coerce a false confession out of someone, let alone from a small black boy isolated within an interrogation room in an incredibly racist, segregated state. Prosecutors claimed he had killed the girls with a railroad spike. George's sisters claimed that he was with them the entire time the murder would have occurred, but their statements were not permitted to be included as evidence. Even worse, the man who found the bodies, Reverend Francis Batson, said that there was hardly any blood in and around the ditch. Therefore, he thought the girls could have been killed elsewhere and dumped there. This was, you guessed it, also not presented during the trial. The court proceedings lasted less than one day, and it only took the jury 10 minutes of deliberation to find George guilty, as a mob of 1,500 people had surrounded the courthouse. He was sentenced to be killed by electrocution, and his small stature made it cruel and unusual. The guards had difficulty strapping him into the chair built for adults. When the switch flipped, the mask covering his face was too big and slipped down, revealing tears streaming from his fear-stricken eyes. 2 more flips of the switch followed. He was pronounced dead on June 16, 1944, a mere 83 days after he was first arrested. This miscarriage of justice was so blatant, and it's crazy that many of our own grandparents were alive when this happened. From the moment he was arrested, his parents were only allowed to visit him once, which was after he had already been convicted. In a recent article recalling how George was taken away by black cars near the chicken coop, Amy, his sister, was quoted saying, "I never saw him again until he was in his casket. That is something I will always see in my memories. His face was burned." George's court-appointed lawyer was useless and did not call any witnesses to the stand, nor cross-examine any of the prosecution's witnesses. He also didn't even address the 2 varying accounts of his alleged confession presented by 2 different police officers when they testified. George's father was fired from his job at the local sawmill, and his family was chased out of town. George's siblings eventually settled up north in New Jersey and New York. The experience was so traumatic that they tried to forget about the cursed town of Alcolu, but that all changed when a local historian by the name of George Frierson began a crusade to get the young boy's conviction overturned. His efforts caught the attention of a South Carolina law firm, Coffey, Chandler, and McKenzie, who have been handling the legal process behind overturning the conviction. During this process, a new piece of information was uncovered. Wilford Hunter, who was in prison at the same time as George, testified that George told him he had been coerced into confessing and that he was innocent. Amy testified that the day before the murders, she and George ran into the girls by the railroad tracks, where they asked if the siblings knew where maypops, a kind of fruit, could be found. Amy still vividly recalled this encounter some 60 years later because it was so unusual for white people to be on the black side of the railroad tracks. The local historian also uncovered hundreds of letters and telegrams from the time of the trial urging the governor to commute the sentence to life imprisonment. Some pleaded that the trial was unfair, while others discussed how black and white men alike were fighting and dying alongside each other during the ongoing Second World War. However, Governor Olin Johnston couldn't help himself and lied in his reply letters, stating that the boy had to be killed because he had raped the bodies of the girls. This, of course, was false, given autopsy records that he had access to. At the time, the governor was running for a U.S. Senate seat, so he likely caved to the white public outcry to kill the boy. Betty June Binneker's family, however, never left the town of Alcolu. Her eventual niece, Frankie Deiches, organized an event at a restaurant there, which, in my opinion, was in quite poor taste. The event was meant to counteract the notion that George Stinney Jr. was innocent, and her logic was, quote,
"Why now? What about in the 1960s when the civil rights movement was starting? What about in the 1970s or 80s? One was a school teacher. It's not as though they weren't educated."
Well, Frankie, once you witness your kid brother get lynched by the legal system and your family gets chased out of town, it takes a lot of time before you trust that same legal system to uphold any justice. Despite Amy's actual presence in this whole matter, considering Frankie was born after her kid aunt's murder, she said she had hate in her heart for no man, even the ones that killed my brother. I feel sorry for the families that lost those little ones. They lost their children, and I lost a brother. That hurts. But for people to sit down and form a judgment in the way they did, to electrocute him, they burned him. It was a horrible death for a child. And in December of 2014, a judge formally vacated George Stinney Jr.'s conviction, determining that he was deprived of due process throughout his trial. Still, it is hard to fathom that the heinous execution of a child was so widely accepted and demanded even by many in South Carolina.